Hello, I'm Megan Davis. I'm with Florida Atlantic University, Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our Florida Senator, Bill Nelson. Senator Nelson's family first arrived on the shores of Florida in 1829, so it's hard to imagine there's someone more qualified to speak on the diverse issues we face today in Florida and also across the nation when it comes to our oceans and our coastal waters. From the State House to the United States House of Representatives to the United States Senate, Senator Nelson has dedicated over 45 years of his life to public service. Throughout his career, Senator Nelson has been a true champion of the environmental issues, and I know that he believes that partnerships are the way to address these issues. Senator Nelson is an active voice in Florida for the restoration and conservation of our Indian River Lagoon, a strong advocate for the health and resiliency of Florida's coastal waters, and a leader for the protection of major ecosystems of our coral reefs and also our Everglades. In addition, Senator Nelson understands the economic value of agriculture in our state. From citrus to livestock, agriculture is an important industry in our state. And in Florida and also nationwide, aquaculture is also considered a form of agriculture. And in the industry, we sincerely appreciate Senator Nelson's advocacy for the growth of the both onshore and offshore aquaculture. As a ranking member of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, Senator Nelson is furthering federal scientific and technology research. It's my true honor to be able to introduce to you Florida's senior senator in the United States Senate, Bill Nelson.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I assume you know, you may not know, but she is a leader in developing commercial aquaculture. Her research is going to ensure that we have sustainable seafood options for the long haul. And what our Florida research institutions have done is just tremendous, great work. How many, I'm curious, are here from Florida? Okay, a few. How many are from the Eastern Seaboard? Oh, anybody from the Pacific? How about the Gulf? Okay, well, welcome. Welcome. Is the Congresswoman Bordallo, is she still here? Okay. Well, I want to thank her for her efforts to protect our coral reefs, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you. You know, I assume that Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island is one of the key people on the oceans, and what a pleasure it is to work with him. So this year's forum is the power of partnerships in advancing ocean science and technology. I last talked to you that in 2012, right in the midst of austere federal budgets, we secured $200 million in a mandatory guaranteed funding for ocean science and technology. You probably didn't believe me, but it's true. And it can serve as a model to stretch each taxpayer dollar further while continuing to explore and understand the oceans. The news, April 20, 2010, an oil rig had exploded 40 miles off of Louisiana's coast. 11 workers were missing. The rig was ablaze. The Coast Guard was on the scene, and then our worst fears were confirmed because the deaths were confirmed. The rig toppled, it fell into the sea, and oil began to gush. The wellhead was 1 mile below the surface of the Gulf. The cut-off safety device did not work. It's supposed to sever that pipe right at the ocean floor, which would stop the flow. It was deficient, and crude floated from a mile deep. A dispersant broke it into teeny droplets, and that diffused like a toxic plume across the seafloor. And it was carried along the currents, west and south, and to the east. Now, the oil that got up on the surface, a slick, the winds started shifting and driving it east, and it covered up as far east as Pensacola Beach. Some oil got onto the beach at Destin. A few tar balls got on to Panama City Beach, but then the wind shifted and went back. But as a result of the pictures of the sugary white sands of Pensacola Beach having been blackened, our guest did not come for one entire tourist season, not just to Northwest Florida beaches, but to the entire Gulf Coast, all the way down to Marco Island. The orangey weathered crude, it coated the wetlands. I went and talked to a couple of LSU research scientists about what was happening to the little killifish. It's a little fish about that big, and it lives in the bayous and in the bays. And where oil had gone into them, as compared to the killifish that are in the non-oiled bays, there was a dramatic difference in the stunting, the reproduction, the actual activity. We called in an alphabet of agencies, from the EPA to the DOI, to ask how much oil was coming out. We found that the U.S. government did not have remotely operated vehicles that could go a mile deep and examine the wellhead and the riser pipe. So Barbara Boxer, Senator Boxer, and I bullied BP into turning over their own footage. I put it on my website. That was the first time, and once, although BP, of course, was saying, oh, it's just a minor spill, once scientists could calculate the flow by seeing the live pictures from the cameras a mile below, then they could see what ended up being almost 5 million barrels of oil that were spilled, barrels, not gallons, into the Gulf as a result of this before they could fix that pipe, of which they've got these very dramatic technological areas where they go in from the side and they intercept the pipe, and then they fill it with concrete. And this is below the surface of the ocean floor. And so we deployed all these resources of the federal agencies to collect as much as possible before the oil spread. I was out with the mayor of Destin in Destin Pass with the U.S. Coast Guard, trying to arrange the what are those screens that you put up with buoys on either side to try to keep the oil from coming in when the tide would flow into Choctawhatchee Bay. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes not. Pensacola Bay had huge tar mats that flowed into Pensacola Bay. And finally, we came together in the Gulf Congressional Delegation to determine what we could do to try to respond to this. And each state had different impacts. In Florida, our economy took the brunt of the impact because of the tourist. Mary Landrieu, of course, was taking the brunt environmentally. Richard Shelby helped us, and we came up with the Restore Act. It was to direct a portion of the Clean Water Act fines paid by BP after a federal judge, which this, of course, took several years. He had to determine, number one, how many barrels of oil were spilled, and then he had to determine the culpability, and therefore the culpability, there was a more of a fine per barrel under the Clean Water Act, multiply the two together, and then they watered it down in a final settlement so that BP could pay, instead of through the Restore Act, they could pay through other acts where they get to deduct their expenses from their income. But there was still about $5 billion that flowed under the Restore Act. And one of my top priorities, and by the way, at one point I thought there might be $15 to $20 billion because ultimately that's what BP paid, that would flow under the Restore Act. Ended up about $5 billion. And what we wanted is a portion of that dedicated to science. And so we required that 2.5% of the funding go to the NOAA Restore Act science program, and another 2.5% go to the Centers of Excellence, each established according to the state of that Gulf state, with the exception of Florida. Because I know what would happen if the Florida legislature and the Florida governor got their hands on it. So we wrote it in the bill that it would go to a consortium of universities already established in law in Florida, both private and public universities and institutions, called the Florida Institute of Oceanography. That's 2.5%. That's Florida's portion of the 2.5%, divvied up among the 5 Gulf states. The other 2.5% goes to this NOAA Restore Act science program. And so because of the settlements, that basically means that over $200 million will go to research, science, observation, monitoring, and technology in the Gulf of Mexico, just in the NOAA program. Now, this money isn't subject to budgets or congressional appropriation. It is the law. And in the 3 years since the trust fund has been up and running, the NOAA science program has funded 22 different projects. These studies are going to help us with decision making about fishery management, restoration, and addressing the effects of climate change and more. This is a success story because it serves as a model for how to creatively fund science and technology. But it isn't the only fun, and it isn't the only model. The research community and private industry is innovating too. We can place sensors on dolphins, on subsea communication cables, on undersea drones, and on surfboard fins. University of South Florida has a project to tow a camera behind a ship to collect data about prized recreational fisheries. NOAA has programs to put some of this technology on board, but there is a lot of more opportunities, and as technology advances, you get the picture. So we've been working on a bill to give NOAA another tool to bring in more data and to strengthen partnerships between the federal government, the research community, and the private sector. C-Robot would authorize $6 million each year for NOAA to purchase ocean-based environmental data. It would establish a novel technology and applied research ombudsman to serve as a hub across all NOAA missions. C-Robot reaffirms NOAA's commitment to full and open data access. Like the Restore Act, C, as in Charlie, Robot won't magically answer all of our ocean science questions, because some people say we even know more about space than we know about the oceans. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but private industry, just like in space, can help us as we explore. C-Robot seeks the kind of win-win partnerships to do just that. Now, I need your help, because Florida's coral reef tract, and it's the third largest on the planet, it's in a tough state. The most serious coral disease epidemic on record globally began in 2014 in isolated areas near Key Biscayne in the Miami metro area. It has since spread to over half of the reef tract. This is a reef tract that starts south of Key West, all the way up the Keys, all the way up the southeastern coast of Florida, all the way up to Fort Pierce. It has a disease that is affecting 23 species of reef-building corals. So I've asked the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of HHS to send an epidemiologist strike team to the region to assist the local efforts to diagnose the disease. Hopefully this will have the power of a partnership. And if we can get the government, academia, the private sector working together on this, we can find a solution to the coral crisis. As I leave you, I want to warn you that the oil industry is unrelenting. The oil industry, through this administration, as you well know, has come up with that they want to drill off of the entire coast. That part about Florida was a political stunt. And of course, the Secretary of the Interior had no authority to do that because it was already filed in the Federal Register. He can't go just and will it. But once having done his political stunt to favor a certain individual in Florida, then all the other governors of the other coastal states said, wait a minute, What are you doing? Well, that's just the latest episode. Let me tell you, there was a time in Florida. Now, I've been fighting this ever since I was a young congressman, when a Secretary of the Interior in the Reagan administration named James Watt, some of you have heard of him, he wanted to drill on the Atlantic coast all the way from Cape Hatteras south to Fort Pierce, Florida. I was the only member of Congress that took him on. I was a congressman that represented Orlando and Florida's part of Florida's East Coast. And the only way I defeated that was putting language in the appropriations bill that said there was no money available to offer the lease tracts, because he had them all there. And the only argument that carried the day that I could get that in the appropriations bill was, obviously you can't put oil rigs out there where we are shooting our military rockets out of Cape Canaveral and we are launching the space shuttle and dropping the SRBs after 2 minutes of flight on the space shuttle. 2 years later, they tried it again under a new Secretary of the Interior, Don Hodel. We did the same thing then and stopped it. In the early part of the George W. Bush administration, they came back with a vengeance. And they were absolutely hell-bent that they were going to drill in the eastern Gulf off of Florida. And I want you to know, the oil industry and the power of the oil industry, they had convinced the chambers of commerce along the Gulf Coast of Florida that this was good for business because it was going to produce a lot of jobs. And I was the only one standing in the way. They even went so far as to run a bill in the Florida legislature, since the first 10 miles off the beach in the Gulf are Florida waters, that they were going to allow drilling in Florida waters. It passed the Florida House and by 1 vote was defeated in the Florida Senate on a tied vote. Okay, you see what I was up against. And I'm telling you this because they're coming back. Things changed when the BP spill occurred. And then the chambers of commerce started to wake up to the fact, well, maybe this isn't so good for our business, since our hotels and our dry cleaners and our restaurants and all the ancillary businesses that go along with our tourism industry, maybe this is not so good. And finally, we got it through to all of the retired military. Up there in these big bases, Eglin Air Force Base, Pensacola Naval Air Station, Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City. Maybe this isn't so good, since we have the largest testing and training area for the United States military in the world is the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida, with all of the sophisticated testing that is going on about long-distance weapon systems that have to fly and be calibrated for long distances. Finally, it got through. But I'm telling you this story. Human nature. The oil industry's coming back. We saw that just a month or two ago, that suddenly the entire outer continental shelf was going to be drilled. So you're in a battle. I need your help, not only with the coral reefs. I need your help on keeping our beaches pristine, keeping our critters as they are in the marshes and the estuaries, keeping them from having to swim around like those little killifish did in that bayou off of Louisiana, where now they are stunted and they're not replicating. I didn't see anybody go to sleep. Thank you very much.